Hi, we're here with Trooper Talk. We're here with Lieutenant Michael Johnston as we are going to be talking about some of Maine's concealed carry laws. And so what we're looking for you is to ask us some of your questions in the comments. We'll be looking at them as we go. I'm here, I'll be posing the questions that I see in the feed to Lieutenant Johnston. We may or may not get to everyone's questions today. So yes, please say hi. Hi, Aaron. And the more people that we can get asking us questions, the more of a conversation that we can have. I'll let Lieutenant Johnston introduce himself and his role here in the Maine State Police.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone made it safe and sound where they were going. The roads are a little icy this morning. So my name is Michael Johnston. I'm a lieutenant with the State Police. I've been with the State Police almost 18 years. A good part of my career was spent up in Troop E barracks, patrolling Penobscot County. I've been at headquarters for about 5 years, lieutenant for the last year. I wear a number of different hats in the State Police, but the one I'm wearing today, the one I'm going to be talking to you about today, is about concealed carry laws and firearm laws more generally.
All right, and while we were waiting for people to, we had mentioned this on our Facebook page yesterday that we were going to be asking this question. And did you want to talk in general about some of the laws and just how they apply to how we enforce them and how they apply to citizens?
Sure. So I'll dispense with a couple things right off the bat. I'll kind of preface it with a little bit of a disclaimer that you shouldn't consider what we're talking about today legal advice, even though it may seem like it is. I'm going to speak about the law as it is generally and as it stands now. You have to understand that with a lot of these laws, there's a criminal penalty attached, so it's really depends on the facts and circumstances of each individual situation as it's investigated by the law enforcement agency and as a determination is made by a district attorney as to whether or not a violation has occurred. I'm also not going to get into laws on when and when you cannot use force. There are several statutes on the book that authorize a private individual to use both deadly force and non-deadly force, but I'm not going to do what-if scenarios on when you can and when you can't. Use of force laws are kind of a complicated mixture of fact and law that really kind of hinge on the individual facts and circumstances of each situation. Suffice it to say, there are laws out there that authorize you to use force. It's really incumbent on each individual to kind of research when that's appropriate. And if you have any questions, direct that to private qualified legal counsel to address it. It's not something we'll do the what if on use of force. Also related to kind of the broader constitutionality of these laws, I'm not going to weigh in on that or some of the policy decisions that are behind them. Our job as the State Police is to enforce the laws as they're passed. So I'm not going to dive into some of the philosophical or constitutional issues about Article 1, Section 16 on the state constitution or the federal constitution, just about the laws more specifically. We
do welcome your input on our Facebook page, though. So thank you for starting some really interesting discussions. And we also did have a very interesting question I believe that you wanted to address right out of the gate.
So there's a couple things that I'll talk about right out of the gate. A question that we often get a lot is, why should I obtain a concealed handgun permit if Maine has passed permitless carry? Permitless carry is often referred to as constitutional carry. I refer to it as permitless carry. So the law was passed went into effect back in October 2015. It was Public Law 327. And it essentially authorized certain individuals to carry a concealed handgun without a permit. And basically what it says is if you're 21 or older and you're otherwise not prohibited from owning or possessing a firearm, and that's a key part, we'll come back to that later, then you can carry a concealed handgun on or about your person. Also, if you're 18, 19, or 20, and you're currently serving in the armed forces, or the National Guard, or you formerly served, as long as you weren't discharged dishonorably, you're also able to carry without a permit. So the reason why a permitting process was left in place for a couple reasons. One of them is out-of-state reciprocity. There are a number of states that recognize Maine's concealed handgun permit. I would advise anyone before you travel to those states, I would check with the individual authority with those states to see if that permit is subject to any restrictions or limitations. I can't speak knowledgeably about other states' laws and regulations. That's incumbent on you to check that out. But the permitting process was left in place for that. Also, there are a number of places in Maine, which I can talk about, where in order to lawfully carry, you still need to possess a valid concealed handgun permit. And I guess thirdly, I think there's a lot of people that subject themselves to the permit process because they feel comfortable going through the process. They feel like it's the right thing to do, and certainly that's their choice. But so I think that's why the permitting process was left in place for those three reasons, even though you essentially can carry concealed without a permit, provided that you meet the age restrictions and that you're not otherwise prohibited from owning or possessing a firearm.
What are some of the places where if you don't have a permit, you can't carry, but with a permit you can?
So good question. So some of these are kind of niche carve-outs that you might not have been aware of, but there's, we'll deal with first with Acadia as a national park. So generally speaking, you're prohibited from owning or possessing a firearm in Acadia National Park. One of the exceptions is if you possess a valid concealed handgun permit that has been issued to a resident of this state or issued to a resident of another state that is valid and recognized in Maine. So that's an area where you would still need a concealed handgun permit. Another area is state parks. Generally speaking, firearms are prohibited within state parks. The exception being is if you possess a valid concealed handgun permit. Also, there's a law that some people aren't aware of. It's under Title 26, Section 600, that if you're an employer, you may have a policy that prohibits an employee from bringing a firearm to work. And that's more of an administrative kind of a employer-employee type issue. However, there's an exception to that where as long as there isn't a law that prohibits bringing it on the property, it's just a workplace policy, you're allowed to store a firearm in your vehicle as long as it's the vehicle is locked and it's secured safely and it's concealed, provided you have a valid concealed handgun permit. So these are just kind of some of the areas where to lawfully carry, you still need that permit.
That's great. All right, I'm going to just check the comments real quick. And this has come up a little bit. Michael is asking, can someone carry in a bar in Maine? Just curious. And I think other people are asking about alcohol and concealed carry as well.
So it's a good question. We get this question a lot. So generally speaking, there's actually two conditions where you'd be prohibited from carrying a firearm into an establishment that's licensed for the on-premise consumption and service of liquor, which is how the statute refers to it. It's under Title 17A, Section 1057. So if the bar has posted a prohibition conspicuously in a manner that's reasonably likely to come to the attention of the patron, and they say no firearms, even though you may have a valid concealed handgun permit, then you are prohibited from bringing that firearm into that establishment. So that is one condition. The second condition is, even if it is not posted and you carry a firearm into that establishment and it is not posted and you lawfully carry it in there, the moment that you become under the influence of intoxicants, which is the same standard that we would use to determine if you're under the influence or impaired to operate a motor vehicle, the moment you reach that threshold, it then becomes a crime to possess that firearm in the establishment. So it's either posted, or if it's not posted, you're in the establishment lawfully carrying, but you have too much to drink and you become impaired or become under the influence.
Thank you. And I'm going to go through some of our stuff from our yesterday's question. Oh, somebody, this was Heather, asked, how do you find out if you are prohibited from carrying a firearm?
So it's really up to the individual. We get this question a lot, and this is probably a good time for me to say there are a number of prohibitions out there at both the state and federal level. Some of them mirror each other. Some of them are slightly different. And if an individual thinks they may be prohibited, the best advice I can give them is to do their due diligence, maybe consult the services of qualified private legal counsel to look into a matter if it was maybe a previous conviction that they're concerned about, if they feel like due to a mental health issue, they might have been involuntarily committed to a mental hospital by order of a district court. these are just some of the reasons that you can be prohibited from owning firearms, but it's really up to the individual to take it upon themselves to really kind of delve into it and make that determination. It's really not, and I guess regarding federal law, so I'm not an authority on federal law. I necessarily have to know something about federal law to do my job and to administer my duties. But I would urge anyone, if it's a question as to federal law, I don't enforce federal law. I'm not the final decision maker on federal law. So I would advise anyone, if it's a matter of federal law, and there's a fairly broad category of laws, federal laws that govern firearms, that you would consult a federal law enforcement agency such as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms regarding the state of federal law.
That's awesome. Thank you.
So Katie, I know
Yes,
one
go
question that we get often is, what should I do if I'm stopped by a law enforcement officer and I'm carrying a firearm?
Excellent question.
So I can tell you, first, the law is that if and this may be another reason why people want to continue to apply for and receive a concealed handgun permit. So if you're carrying without a permit under the provisions of the Permitless Carry law, then you have an affirmative duty to notify law enforcement immediately upon contact, and contact is defined as a traffic stop, an arrest, or some other investigative detention. You have to notify them immediately if you're carrying a concealed handgun. You are not required to do that if you're carrying with a permit. So without a permit, required to notify law enforcement. With a permit, you're not required to notify. However, people still ask, should I? Well, that's your individual decision. Out of an abundance of caution, I found in my experience that people I have contact with that are carrying firearms, and it's very normal, it's part of Maine's tradition, Maine's culture to carry firearms, that they will notify law enforcement that they do have a firearm. I would just advise them to just notify them, be very deliberate, matter of fact. Law enforcement bases our actions on behaviors. Just the fact that you're carrying a firearm by itself without anything more does not mean that we would change our posture. We're always cognizant and aware of officer safety, but it's behavior based. But if an officer is approaching you on a traffic stop, then I would just remain still, keep your hands on the wheel, make sure they're visible. Let the officer know when you feel it's appropriate. If you're carrying without a permit, notify him immediately. Just say, hey, I have a handgun in the vehicle. You may tell him where it is. I think you're going to find, well, I can't speak for every police officer, that they're going to say, okay, we appreciate you letting me know, and they'll continue with the course of the traffic stop. Don't make any sudden furtive movements, and the traffic stop should be fairly uneventful, and the officer will do his job, make the appropriate checks, and you'll be on your way.
That's excellent. Thank you. We've been getting a lot of reciprocity questions. There's a person who wanted to know if they're a resident in Massachusetts, if they are allowed to carry concealed in Maine, and so on. Maybe just address reciprocity in general.
Sure. So I touched on reciprocity a little bit earlier. So Maine's law on reciprocity basically says we will recognize a resident concealed handgun permit in Maine if your state, your home state, recognizes ours. So we kind of point the finger at your state, and that's generally how it's worded. So we have a listing on the state police website of some states that we honor. Now, it is not a comprehensive list, and I always urge people, if you're going to another state and want to know about Maine's, check with them. So the question, as far as I know, Massachusetts license to carry, which is a little different than Maine. Again, I'm not authority on Massachusetts, but as far as I'm aware, Massachusetts does not recognize Maine's permits. And that is the central question. If they recognized our permits, we would recognize theirs. So I would advise you to check with Massachusetts to see if they recognize Maine's permits. That's kind of the central question, Maine's resident permits. If they do, then generally speaking, then we would recognize the permit here. Now, if you're 21 or older, or if you've been in the military or are in the military, then you would fall under the permitless carry provision, and you would be covered there.
That's excellent. Thank you. Someone was asking about if they have a medical marijuana card, how that affects their concealed carry capabilities.
So it's a good question. And again, this is kind of, I'll refer back, this is kind of an interplay between both federal law and state law. And this is something that I would likely punt to a prosecutor on, although I can tell you that we do have a statute that mirrors federal law that says you're prohibited from owning or possessing a firearm if you're an unlawful user or addicted to a controlled substance, and it cites federal law as to what is the determining factor as to whether there's a controlled what is a controlled substance. And as we all know, under federal law, marijuana is recognized as a controlled substance, and there's no authorized exceptions or allowable uses for marijuana. So this is something that each individual prosecutor kind of has to address, but the federal law on it is very clear. If you attempted to buy a firearm from a licensed federal firearms dealer, then on the 4473 form, which is a firearms transaction form, if you disclose that you were a medical marijuana user, by federal law, they cannot complete that transaction and sell you a firearm. It's a little different at the state level, where the state has allowed both medical and recreational marijuana use. So this is a question that comes up a lot, and it's really up to each individual prosecutor. But generally speaking, the state law mirrors the federal law. And it says that if you're addicted to a controlled substance, and it points to the federal laws to how you determine what a controlled substance is. So it's again, I would advise you that it's generally not prudent to be in possession of a firearm if you're under the influence of either alcohol or drugs or some other intoxicant. But that question is kind of still up in the air. It's something that law enforcement and Maine prosecutors kind of deal with every day, make a determination on it, and I would defer to them on that.
Excellent. This one's a bit getting back to the basics. Tina wants to know if you can carry your firearm so it's visible or not visible, and how does the concealed carry affect that? Like, does it make a difference legally speaking?
So, concealed carry, and when you need a permit or when permitless carry applies, it does have to be concealed. Now, there are certain areas of the state where you can't lawfully open carry, like Acadia. Acadia, we mentioned you can carry in Acadia if you have a valid permit, but you can't open carry. So the only way to lawfully carry is if it's concealed. It can't be conspicuous. But generally speaking, unless you are prohibited, like a school zone or some other area where by law you're prohibited from owning or carrying a firearm, open carry is allowed in Maine, and it's not regulated. Unless the area itself, you can't have a firearm, period. So the permitless carry and the concealed handgun permit regulate carrying a concealed handgun on or about your person. If it's open carry and it's not concealed, then that's not regulated at all.
Excellent. Are we in favor of an Allstate's permit?
Well, it's essentially what you have already. So under the concealed handgun permitting statutes, a concealed handgun permit that's issued by the state police or local police department or some other issuing authority is good throughout the state. So, the permit that we issue, the permit that a local police department issues, the permit that some other small town issuing authority issues, they're all considered equal. So it's good throughout the state. So that's essentially what you have. You just don't have a single issuing authority. The state police will issue permits for all non-residents, and those areas where you don't have their own organized police departments in the unorganized territories.
Excellent. Adam is asking, he had taken the concealed carry class and had a valid permit but let it lapse. When constitutional carry came out, he wants to know if he can resend for concealed carry, or will he need to take the class again?
So it depends. What I would advise you is to check with your individual issuing authority. They are they make the final say. How the state police handles it is you have to have handgun safety that's current within the past 5 years. If you're applying for a concealed handgun permit, you can satisfy handgun safety in a number of different ways. It can be if you've been in the military and you have your DD-214, that's acceptable. If a sworn law enforcement agency can vouch that you are knowledgeable in matters of handgun safety, then that is also acceptable. The most common way is if you've taken a course by a private organization that's recognized as being knowledgeable and reputable in the matters of handgun safety, and you submit a handgun safety course, that is also sufficient. I would urge you to just check with your local area or some of the gun shops in your area. They generally can refer you. I don't want to promote or recommend a specific agency. That wouldn't be fair. But for us, that handgun safety needs to be current within the last 5 years for us to accept it.
Excellent. We're getting a lot of questions that we've sort of answered previously. Some of it is asking about past violations, if they have the ability to carry and things like that. And we'd like, you would have to check. You would want to make sure that you aren't in violation if you want to go hunting or something like that. If you have a past conviction and stuff like that, you want to do your due diligence to make sure that you are not in violation. And let's see. What are some other general questions that you are frequently getting that we haven't addressed thus far?
So some people will ask what else they can carry concealed. So it's important to remember that if you have a concealed handgun permit, or if you're carrying under permitless carry, or AKA constitutional carry, that applies to a handgun. You cannot carry a long gun concealed. Some people will refer to it as a concealed weapons permit. It is a concealed handgun permit. There's also certain categories of weapons that you cannot carry concealed on or about your person or wear under your clothes, regardless of whether you have a permit or not. That's defined in the statute. You'll find this category of weapons under Title 25, Section 2001-A, where generally speaking, you can't carry a dirk, a stiletto, which is like a stabbing, a dagger type, a Bowie knife, or some other weapon that's usually employed on the attack or defense of a person. So there are certain categories, a slingshot you can't carry concealed. So these are things that you cannot lawfully carry at all, whether you have a permit or not. And long guns, you can't lawfully carry concealed. It only applies to handguns.
Excellent. Someone wants to know, if their town doesn't have a police department, what's the process for getting a permit?
So check with your town office to see. There are towns that are issuing authorities that don't have their own police departments. So I would check with your town, and they would be able to tell you. On the Maine State Police website, if you were to Google Maine State Police concealed handgun permits, it would bring you to our website. There's a lot of resources on there. One of them shows the towns in Maine that the state police does issue for. If your town is not included on that list, then your town is responsible for issuing the permits, and it's up to you to go to your town and work it out through them.
Excellent. John is asking, on a road trip from Maine to Florida with firearms, what should they do when they're traveling through states that don't recognize our process?
I can't tell you exactly what you need to do when traveling from point A to point B, when that carries you through a number of states. I can only speak to Maine. The best advice I can give you is to check with those, and I understand and realize it can be a little difficult and a little burdensome, but you really have to check with each individual state to determine how you can lawfully transport a firearm within that state. You may reach out to a law enforcement agency, a state police agency. They're in the best position to give you guidance on that. For Maine, if you can lawfully carry a concealed handgun in a vehicle because you have a permit or because it's under permitless carry, then you can carry a loaded concealed handgun on or about your person. If you're transporting a long gun for hunting or other recreational purposes, then you need to have it unloaded, which means you can't have a round inserted into the chamber or inserted into a magazine that's inserted into the weapon. So you need to keep that unloaded and then stored outside the passenger compartment of the vehicle, which, depending on the vehicle, may be the back end. It may be, if it's in a pickup truck, it does not need to be exposed to the bed, just as long as it's in the normal passenger compartment area, which kind of differs depending on what type of vehicle you have. But other states, check with those authorities to see what's lawful.
Excellent. And how often, Emily wants to know, how often do you need to renew your permits?
So permits are good for 4 years. So it's important that we receive the renewal on or before the expiration date. And your permit will continue to remain in effect until the issuing authority has processed it, made a decision as to whether or not the permit will be renewed. But it's important that it's a timely application that we receive on or before the expiration date for that permit to continue to remain in effect until it's either been denied or it's been renewed.
Excellent. And Corinne is asking if we would clarify handgun safety class requirements for the renewal of a current or valid license.
So it's So the statute is basically, it says, I think I referenced this earlier, there are a number of ways to satisfy handgun safety. The most common way is people take a course, and that is up to each individual issuing authority on what they will accept. They have the discretion to determine what's appropriate, what's acceptable. For the state police, we will not accept an online course. It has to be an in-person course, and it has to have a certificate that you submit to us that on its face was administered by a private organization that's recognized as being knowledgeable in matters related to firearms. So there's a number of different entities, organizations, businesses out there that will offer handgun safety. And as long as on its face it appears to be reputable and reliable and there isn't anything that indicates otherwise, we'll accept that. But we will not accept an online course. It needs to be an in-person course of instruction.
Excellent. Janettas is wondering what we can carry for protection besides a gun.
So there's a number of different weapons laws that are out there, and I don't. They're pretty lengthy. I don't want to get into each individual one here, but there's a number of different things that you can carry for defense of yourself or somebody else other than a firearm, and as long as there isn't a statute that prohibits their possession. For example, chemical agents such as mace, it is permissible to carry those. So some states they outlaw it, some states you have to have a permit. Maine, we have a statute that's criminal on the disabling use of chemicals, but provided it's used in accordance with law and it fits the definition for self-defense, you are allowed to carry a chemical agent. As long as there's not a statute that I alluded to earlier that prohibits the outright possession or the concealment of it, then you're allowed to use that in defense of your person. Mace is the most common one we get, and again, tasers. There's a statute that makes criminal use of an electronic device, disabling device, a crime, but provided that you're using it responsibly in accordance with the law. Possession of a taser by itself without anything more is not a violation. It's just really incumbent on the individual to make sure they're using it responsibly and in accordance with the laws regarding self-defense.
Excellent. We've been getting a couple questions about carrying concealed near schools, what the distance is that you need to keep back from the schools, does it vary by school, and so forth? Sure.
So it's a good question, which it's pretty much a bright line rule. So the school laws under Title 20A, 6557, and it's basically a bright line rule. You cannot carry firearms on public school property or approved private school property, period. So if you are on the property, public school, or if it's been an approved private school as determined by the state, that is a gun-free zone, and you cannot carry firearms on that property. No exceptions, period. There's also another law that prevents discharge of a firearm within 500 feet of private school property and public school property and approved private school property. So discharge of firearms is generally regulated by municipal ordinance. In this case, you have a state law. But there's also a federal law, but I'm going to only speak to the state law because that's what I'm in charge of enforcing. And it's when they say it's a gun-free zone, that is true.
Excellent. All right. We've been getting a lot of repeat questions. I'm trying to see if there's some new ones. If you feel like we've skipped over your question, we're going to be posting this video in its entirety. Please feel free to watch the entire thing. We have been getting a lot of questions about personal use of force and defending yourself and things like that. We're not going to go case by case and do hypothetical situations on all the different ways that deadly force might be utilized. But I think we have been doing this for about a half hour. If we didn't cover your question or you feel like we should have, feel free to message us. We will get your question answered as soon as we possibly can. And thank you, Lieutenant Johnston, for taking this time. Is there anything you think we may have missed?
So I was just looking over my notes just to see if there's anything we hadn't covered. So the other question that we will sometimes get, this may be a good place to finish on unless we get some more questions from the audience, is private property. So a private property owner generally has the right to prohibit firearms on their premises. That is, and putting it another way, your right or ability to possess a firearm doesn't trump their right to prevent firearms on their property as a private property owner. But it's the prohibition kind of manifests itself in, if you bring a firearm into a private property, let's say it's a laundromat or some other business, and it comes to the attention of the owner or of a manager or someone who's kind of licensed or privileged to kind of enforce the rules of that business, and they ask you to leave, and that provides a basis for them to say, I'd like you to leave the property, or I'd like you to put your firearm in your vehicle or secure it, or you're not allowed to have firearms or something like that, and you refuse to leave, then that essentially provides the basis for a criminal trespass. So that's a question we oftentimes get, is if I bring a firearm onto the property, they reserve the right to tell you to secure it or to have you to leave, and that would be a lawful order. And then if you remain there in defiance of that lawful order from someone who's licensed or privileged to issue it, or you return there in defiance of that order from a law enforcement agency or from the manager or owner, then that would generally provide the basis for a criminal trespass.
Excellent. And we did get a question yesterday about, since this law has been on the books for quite a while, why we're talking about these things now. These trooper talks are something that we're going to be doing on a regular basis, sometimes with Lieutenant Johnston, sometimes with Lieutenant Scott and other troopers who are experts in their fields. So what we want from you guys is to think of other topics that you'd like us to cover, and we'll be doing this once a month, once every other month as time allows. But this is something that we want to do on the regular basis. So we want to thank everyone who has tuned in. We appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.